They say that some of the best works of literature, the best poetry is written through suffering. It's written through pain, it's written through real life experience. There are very few authors that are able to pull that off without going through some real hardship in life. The same is true with our faith. We're formed through struggle, we're formed through hardship. Our world wants to say, be tough, be strong, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You're going to have to be disciplined, you're going to have to do this on your own. No one's going to be there to help you. Do not show signs of weakness. But when it comes to God, there's a different message. When it comes to God, it's saying, when we are weak, then we are strong. When we recognize that we are weak, then God has the opportunity to show us new things. As long as we think we're strong, as long as we're proud, we're not going to be able to surrender to the will of God, to submit, to see what it is that He is doing. Paul discusses this in two very important chapters of 2 Corinthians. The first time is in chapter 4, and the second time is in chapter 12. I want to read some of that and discuss a theology of weakness, because in our American culture, we don't like to show weakness. We don't like to expose ourselves to liabilities or to put ourselves out there in a way that shows people that we have chinks in our armor, because people are going to exploit that. And so because of that, we build ourselves up and we build walls and we get prideful, and then it gets very hard to see God or the work of God in our lives. It becomes an obstacle or barrier to our faith. So pain, weakness, suffering become an opportunity for us to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear what God is actually doing in this world. So Paul starts off in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5 saying, we're not preaching ourselves. That's the modern motivational speech, mantra. We're preaching ourselves. Take Jordan Peterson, who has some decent things to say. He's a very insightful person in certain ways, helped me in certain ways. But one of the things that I disagree with him on is he says that as men, we have to become monsters who then we control. We control the monster. I totally get where he's coming from. I see where that could be helpful in a pragmatic sense, but I don't think that is at the heart of the Christian gospel, nor is he saying it's at the heart of the Christian gospel. He's saying it's pragmatic. Peterson is saying you have to get yourself into a position where you can deal with the things that are coming at you so that you don't get steamrolled in life, so that people don't roll and run over you or take advantage of you. You're going to have a backbone and stand up for yourself. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. We don't want to get run over, but sometimes we are going to get run over. And it's not that we are not to be strong, it's just the idea of where that strength comes from, that there's a greater strength that does not come from ourselves, but it comes from God Himself. And so here's what Paul says after he says, we do not preach ourselves. This is not the gospel of us. If we're preaching ourselves as the gospel of us, then we're going to be prideful, we're going to be boastful. But no, we're not going to boast in ourselves, we're only going to boast in the Lord. And so he says in verse 7, chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. The power is from God and not from us. Take someone like David Goggins, who sometimes talks about some things about maybe possibly believing in God. I think maybe, he does, but he's very much about that the power comes from self and not from anywhere else or from anyone else. No, we have a treasure that's in a jar of clay. And I think he would recognize that he is a jar of clay, that he has weaknesses. He's trying to stamp out those weaknesses by his own efforts, by his own discipline, by the hardening of his mind. I get it. That's pragmatic. But it doesn't take into account the gospel. It doesn't take into account the power of God to change our lives in spite of our weaknesses, in spite of our frailties. So this treasure that we have of the salvation that we have through Christ, the good news of Jesus, it's all held within an earthen vessel, a jar of clay, to show that the power is not ours, but it's God's. He says we're hard-pressed on every side, not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. And so now we're always carrying around the death of Christ in our bodies so that we might then show the life of Christ through our bodies. And then in chapter 12, Paul carries this on. And he says that he's going to keep boasting, but not boasting in himself. He's going to boast in the Lord. And he says that because God had shown him all these amazing things, it was very tempting for him to be prideful and to be boastful and to be filled up. I mean, have you ever had God do something in your life where God answered a prayer or there was a testimony and it was so tempting to make it about you or make it about me, and we failed to recognize that the story was really about God and not about us? Paul had some amazing, crazy stories Think about all the things that he could have shared in the midst of a bunch of men going, yeah, well, then I did this and I did that. And then we saw God do this. And the rest of the people, he knows the rest of the people are thinking, well, I've never seen that. I've never been a part of that. And so to keep Paul, he says, from being conceited, God gave him a thorn in his flesh, specifically to keep him from being conceited, 12:7. And he says, I asked God 3 times to take it away, but God said, this is so important. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. My power is made perfect in your weakness. We have to come to embrace our weakness if we're going to have the eyes to see the strength of God. We will never be able to accept or be a vessel for the power of God if we are not first, the prerequisite, very much in tune with our weakness, with our thorns in the flesh, with the things that keep us humble, the sins that, and I'm not saying God gave Paul sin, I'm just saying our sin reminds us to be humble. Our inability to carry out the gospel should humble us. We cannot carry on the gospel proclamation and work without the power of the Holy Spirit. You and I can say words, but we can't change hearts. That should keep us from being prideful. It should keep us from being conceited, so that when people are reached and when people come to Christ and become disciples and convert to Christianity, we recognize that it was through our fumbling and bumbling and weakness that any of this even took place, because it was God's power and not our power. I think sometimes maybe there's a failure to find movement because we have bought into worldly schemes of church governance and vision that really relies on our own power, our own self-sufficiency, our own ability to make something happen. We need to take a good deep look inside and make sure that we're not buying the worldly message, that it's all up to us, it's all up to our own power. It's deism. It's saying God's not really involved. God doesn't really do much of anything, so why would you ask him for help? So the worldly solution is get stronger, try harder, raise more money, ask more people. Here's Paul's response to God saying, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in you being weak. Oh, he says, then, you know what? If I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. Can you imagine that? Someone boasting about their weaknesses? You know, these motivational speakers, they talk about weaknesses and they talk about our abilities to overcome them, but they never talk about them as something to boast in, because they can't see any benefit in us talking about our weaknesses or us reveling in our weaknesses. It sounds like pity. It sounds depressing. And it's not that we talk about our weaknesses just for the sake of talking about our weaknesses. We're saying God is doing amazing things even though we're weak, so we know it's not us. We know that it's him. And so then Paul says something crazy, verse 10. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness. Imagine that. Imagine feeling weak, and you, instead of going, wow, I'm pitiful, you were to say, this is an opportunity for God to shine. This is an opportunity for God to show off today, because I can't do this without him. He says not only will he boast about his weaknesses, he says, this allows Christ's power to rest on me. He's got a secret weapon. The secret weapon is not be more disciplined, wake up earlier than the other guy, stay up later and work harder and all this. The secret is that when you recognize your weakness, then the power of Christ is truly able to be demonstrated through your life. If we claim to have power and we're trying to demonstrate our power, there is not room for the power of Christ to be able to be seen or work, because our power is crowding it out. Let me read that again. He says in verse 9, but God said to me, even though he was asking to have this thorn in the flesh taken away 3 times, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's what Christ said to him. And then Paul's response to that is, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. I literally heard David Goggins say the other day, maybe you have too, where he says, I take all the haters online and I take all these nasty things that they say and I write them down and I record myself saying them into a recorder, and then I play them on my runs over and over again. You can't do this, you're this and that and the other. It's like he is reveling in insult, but not for the same reason that Paul is. Goggins is reveling in insult to motivate him to prove them wrong. Paul is not doing it for that reason. Paul is like, you're right. I am weak. The insults probably and sometimes are actually correct. And that's okay, because that gives opportunity for God to work. And when God works, it's so much better than when I work. When God works, it's so much more effective, so much more wise, so much more powerful than when I work. And so when I demonstrate my weaknesses and I'm in tune with my weaknesses, then I begin to lean on God, rely on God, trust in God in a way that I'm not able to do if I think I'm self-sufficient. We need to have a healthy view of ourselves and our own weaknesses so that we can also have a healthy view of God and God's purposes. Now, this does not give us an excuse to sin. Well, then, Matt, if I just go about sinning and doing all this awful stuff, indulge in my weaknesses, then that'll give God power to shine. That's Romans 6:1. Shall we go on sinning then so that grace may increase? By no means, he says. So we cannot do that. That's not what Paul is talking about here. So let's revel in our weakness. Let's revel in the insults. They're going to come, but it only allows God's power to shine through. Think about that. Someone insults you for what you're doing in the kingdom, and instead of turning on them in hatred and bitterness and anger and discord, you turn to them with prayer. Pray for your enemies. You turn to them with love. Love your enemies. You turn to them with gentleness and compassion. What happens in that moment? Christ is seen in you. The power of Christ is made known through your weaknesses. It's a powerful weapon. It's the secret weapon that nobody who comes at this from a worldly perspective of motivation, desire for self-improvement will ever be able to understand apart from the power of the Spirit, apart from the Word of God. So yes, we're weak. I'm weak. I mess up all the time. And it gives God an opportunity to shine. It gives me an opportunity to decide, am I going to trust him or am I going to go my own way? Am I going to look to him for his power? Am I going to do it my way? Thanks for watching this. If you haven't subscribed, I'd love for you to do that. At least hit that thumbs up and watch another video. I'm putting another one up here on the screen. Y'all take care.